$1.78 billion. That was how much the Powerball drawing was 2 weeks ago, last night, right? $1.78 billion. It was the second highest lottery drawing in the history of the United States lottery since 2022, where it was like $2.02 billion. Up until 2 weeks ago, there had not been a single winner since like May 31st. How do you begin to calculate $1 million or $1 billion? I mean, I find myself sometimes, and maybe you're like me, of imagining if you had received that much money, right? I mean, the things that I would do, including paying off my student loans, maybe taking my parents on a nice vacation for the loans that they took out so I could go to college. I wonder, what would that gift do to transform our life here at Trinity? Or when so many in our community suffer from not having affordable housing or food insecurity, if we took just 1 million of that. I think often of us think that if we were to win all of a sudden a large sum of money, all of our problems would just disappear. I mean, after all, there was 2 winners in 2 weeks ago's Powerball drawing, and each of them, after taxes, and the government will take about 40% out in taxes, will still walk away with $258 million, which is enough money to buy 4 brand new Gulfstream private jets. Or if you're okay with it not being new, 7 slightly used Gulfstream jets. I mean, but still, I've never even been in a Gulfstream. I don't think I've seen a Gulfstream in person, right? So how do we conceptualize just how much money that is? So I went to Google, and I asked Google, how many seconds are in a million? How many seconds are there in a million? There is about 11 and a half days in a million seconds. It's like 11.67 days. How many seconds are in a billion? Is what I asked Google next. And Google came back with a staggering 31.69 years. That's the difference between a million and a billion. Now, I have never known anyone who has won the Powerball, or at least they've never told me that they've won the Powerball, right? And I think that there is this myth out there that if all of a sudden you were to receive these millions of dollars, that all of your problems would just float away, because that is certainly, I think, often what society tells us, that if you just earn a little bit more money, if you just, invest and just store up all these treasures, you'll be able to retire happily and healthy, and you'll have money, and you'll be able to do the things that you do, and that money will buy you happiness. And it's interesting that there was a study done in the 70s where they took people who had won the lottery and compared them to those who had been injured in accidents and had suffered from some form of being paralyzed. And they found that people who won the lottery weren't any more happy after a year. Or we know that about 70% of people who win the lottery within a few years end up declaring bankruptcy. that many of them report significant strain on family relationships and with friendships, because all of a sudden everyone knows that they've received all of this money and start to call them up asking if they can borrow from them. And that really, while in the short term, there can be incredible joy and happiness, that joy and happiness does not last, and that it is temporary. The Apostle Paul is writing to young Pastor Timothy in this really personal letter that we have the chance of overhearing today. And in this letter, which is relatively short, Paul spends a significant amount of time talking about money, talking about material possessions and wealth. And it's not to make those who have money feel guilty. It's not to try to say that they are some way sinful because that they have money, but to point out that that money does not guarantee happiness. That just because you have material possessions or wealth does not mean that you are rich in the eyes of the kingdom of God. And Paul is trying to encourage this community that he cares so much about, that young Timothy is leading, to be very careful about where they place their resources and their trust. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been in our sermon series that we've titled Reboot, where we have been looking at what does it mean to reconcile, to reimagine, and today, to rethink about what happiness looks like in our world. It's something like each of us, on average, receive about 10,000 messages each day in the form of advertising, of commercials, and on our phones, and on billboards, and in the newspaper, the things that we need that will guarantee to make us happier and healthier and, smarter and more beautiful every day. And yet at the same time, whereas a country where we have the more amount of financial resources than perhaps ever before, Americans increasingly report a greater level of unhappiness and dissatisfaction with their life and the relationships in their life. I'm sure that you have seen the reports where we have been told that we actually have an epidemic of loneliness amongst our lands. We see where young people, children, are reporting that they would rather end their life because they are so unhappy and they feel bullied and alone in school, rather than continue living in the pain and the unhappiness. And so it seems that while there's this myth out there that money can solve all of our problems and bring us joy and happiness, we hear a message today that confronts that. And most of the time when we talk about money in the church, it's because, well, the church wants your money so we can do the mission, and we want to talk about stewardship. But Paul doesn't say anything about that today, but rather giving this cautionary word to us who place our trust and our hope in anything that is not God. At the core of our lesson today, Paul is telling Timothy to be content with what you have, remembering that it is not yours, but that it is God's. That the things that you have received are blessings from God. And that happiness is not found in material possessions or in this world, but is found in Jesus Christ. It is found, or as Paul says in verse 17, by being rich in good works, in living generously. As Lutherans, we get a little shy sometimes when we hear good works because it feels a lot like works righteousness. And as Lutherans, we do not believe that we do good works to earn our salvation. We do not do good works so God, loves me a little bit more and sees how great I am as a human being. Or we want to tilt the scales, if you've ever watched The Bad Place versus the Good Place. Have you done more good things than bad things to get you into the good place? But rather, we live our lives being rich in good works so that we can share God's love with others, that we can share the blessings and the abundance that we have been given with others. And that if we have a roof over our heads, a car in our driveway, food in our cupboards and our refrigerators, then we're better than about 92% of the world's population that lives in food insecurity and housing insecurity, where bombs destroy neighborhoods, where we see widespread famine in places like Gaza, where children are dying on the streets. We live our lives being rich in good works because that is how we share God's love with others. We live our lives rich in good works, recognizing that it's not about me and about what I want, but rather what is best for the community that God has called us into and to be a part of. Happiness that does not waver, happiness that does not rust or disappear, that is not temporary, as a happiness that is grounded in the life and in the death and in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. A happiness that is not overcome by the evils of this world that we live in, is a happiness that is so welded into recognizing that all of humanity is created in the image of God. The author of Hebrews writes in chapter 13, verse 5, "Be content for such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." As people of faith, we are called to live our lives knowing that God is with us wherever we go. Wherever we find ourselves to be in this life, God is there. And that there is an incredible richness and joy in that. That does not mean that our lives will be painless and that everything will be easy, that we won't ever encounter stormy weather. It doesn't mean that there won't ever be really hard days in our life of faith, but rather the promise that Jet will read in his pages of his Bible is that God will be with him through those storms, through those tribulations, through those dark moments where Jet will find himself walking through the valley of the shadow of death. God will be with him, journeying with him, and will never leave him. One of the biggest lies I think society tells us is that we need more, that we don't have enough. When our Christian faith calls us to look at the things that we have and to say that we do have what we need, that God is with us, that we have been called to live together in partnership and in relationship and in community with one another. I don't know what the antidote is to winning the Powerball and to not going bankrupt or not experiencing financial ruin or strained relationships, but I do know that if as Christians we live our lives in such a way that we live them and rich in good works. We practice generosity. We live our lives with gratitude every day. That when we do finally win that Powerball, maybe, it won't be overwhelming to us because we've been living rich all along. Rich in God's love, rich in relationship, rich in community, rich with being content with what we have, not wanting more, and rich in living generously. That, friends, is the foundation to happiness. That is the foundation to rebooting our lives, of practicing what I think good and healthy stewardship looks like in our world today. Knowing that we are called to work together in humble service, not for our own gain, but for our neighbors next door to us, and for our neighbors around the world from us. So together, this week, in whatever circle that you find yourself in, don't forget that happiness in God's kingdom, happiness in the eyes of Jesus, is the practice of living richly in good works, generously through service and love, and with humility for ourselves and with others. Amen.